Today we're going to be talking about the resurrection of Jesus and what that means for us. The reason I've chose this topic is simply because it's been a while since I talked about Jesus, and I felt like that's what I wanted to do this Sunday. But we're going to look at it in kind of a different way. We're not just going to look at it as it happened, but what that means for us and how it should impact our behavior. Okay, and so the resurrection, in case you don't know, resurrect means to come back from the dead, is an integral part of Christianity. It means a lot. It means a lot to what Christianity is. And mainly because the resurrection offers us hope for a future. And not a future as in beyond this reality. It offers us hope in a reality beyond our current reality that is perfect and lacking absolutely nothing. And it's very significant. And that should impact our behavior. That should impact how we interact. That should impact how we go about our days and our attitudes. There are people, definitely, alive in our world today that don't live with this kind of hope. And I think even us as Christians, if you are in this room, sometimes you forget about it. I find it a harsh belief to accept that this is all that there is. I find that harsh because you think about contexts such as people living in the third world where children are starving to death and things like that are happening. It's harsh for that to say, well, this is just your lot in life. This is just the way it is for you. These are the cards that you're dealt. That's it, right? That's a hopeless, harsh belief. So let's look at it. We're gonna jump quick to Luke chapter 24, verse 1 to 9. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they went to the tomb, they being the women. They took spices that they had prepared, and they found the stone rolled away from the tombs. The tomb that Jesus was buried in was like a cave, and there was this big stone that was rolled in front of it. But when they were in, they did not find the body of Jesus. While they were perplexed about this, behold, two men stood by them in dazzling apparel. These are angels, okay? So the angels are standing there. And as they were frightened and bowed their face to the ground, these men said to them, "Why do you seek the living amongst the dead?" This is actually kind of comedic because I don't think that the angels are viewing things through the same lens as the humans are in this scenario. They're like, what are you doing here? Like, why are you looking for the living amongst the dead? Let's go on. It says, "He isn't here. He has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified and on the third day rise." Really, they're saying, like, what are you so surprised about? He told you this was going to happen. They don't understand the confusion of these women. I always think that's kind of funny. And they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all of these things to the 11 and to the rest. So there's the actual event that happened. And again, it carries significant meaning for us because had Jesus not come out of the grave, faith in Christianity today would not look as it looks like. And it should, like I said, it should impact our behavior. I wrote this illustration here. Now that I'm standing up here, I don't know why I put it in here, but I'll say it anyway. There's a few years ago, Kristen and I were in Kamloops. And I can't remember if this was December 24th, Christmas Eve, or December 26th, Boxing Day. But either way, this was a busy time, right? There's lots happening. We're going to the mall, either to look for Boxing Day sales or last-minute Christmas presents. And so there's a lot happening. I'm in the driver's seat. People are moving everywhere. There's like 100 cars that you got to look out for at once. And I didn't see this lady, and she didn't see me. And she's coming across the crosswalk. I'm looking over here. She's coming this way. I look, and I see her, and we make eye contact, and I slam on the brakes right away because I'm coming pretty dangerously close to this woman. And she had this scrunchy look on her face. She's walking like this, hands in her pockets. And the minute I slammed on my brakes, she just flips me the bird, just like that. Like so fast. Like she had it preloaded in her pocket. And she was waiting for an excuse to do it. I don't know what happened to this lady in the store, but I sure paid for it in that moment. And Kristen and I, we weren't even angry. We were just amazed at just the attitude of this lady walking around. She did not have the hope of the resurrection of Jesus in her life. Her behavior was not impacted by that event, okay? I guess that's why I put that in there. Okay. Oh, man. See, James and Marie aren't here today, so everybody's feeling unruly. At the time of the resurrection of Jesus, the main teachings and the religious teachings there were based off of Levitical law. This was a law that back when the Israelites were wandering in the desert, that Moses, or God gave to Moses, and Moses presented before the people Israel. And they had built a community since that day based off of the Levitical law. And there was at least two main that I'm going to touch about, laws that were given for the Israelite people. One of them is the establishment of a resting place of God among the people. So when it was in the desert, they had a tent that they carried around. Inside this tent was the Ark of the Covenant, and that was like God's resting place on earth. And so the Levites, they carried that around, and eventually that evolved into when they entered the Promised Land, they built a temple, and they put the Ark of the Covenant in a room called the Holy of Holies. And this room was God's presence on earth. That's where it was. Ark of the Covenant was there. And this place, the presence of the holiness of God was so prevalent in that room that there was a certain ritual for them to be able to enter it. First of all, they could only go in, I think it was once a year. And whoever would go in, they would have to go through a ritualistic cleansing so that they could be made pure, so that the holiness of God wouldn't kill them. I don't think people really wanted to go in because they cast straws, they cast lots to see who would go in, and the guy that would have to go in, they'd tie a rope around him in case he didn't cleanse properly and he died, so that they could pull him back out. So it was the establishing of a temple. The second one was the sacrifice for sin. There was 4 different types of sacrifices that God gave Moses as sacrifices for 2 of them were for sin, right? So that if you did something wrong, you would perform the sacrifice. And the Bible says that it was like a bad aroma before God, but that's how you would cover your sin. And the second ones were sacrifices of thanksgiving and praise. So that when you would sacrifice those, it says like it was a sweet aroma to God. And so there was the establishing of sacrifices. Now here comes Jesus into this culture, into this context, and he's saying all kinds of outlandish things that don't make any sense to the people there. In John chapter 2, verse 19, Jesus, talking about the temple, he says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." That doesn't make any sense. It's a huge building. How is one guy going to build it up? This is craziness. And so, again, in John chapter 14, verse 6, Jesus said, "I am the way, I am the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." He is saying, I am the Messiah. I am the only way to the Father. And again, this is outlandish to them. It doesn't make any sense. Remember, at his death, they called him a blasphemer. They called him heretical. Again, at John chapter 2, verse 29, Jesus talked about as the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. The Lamb was the sacrifice for sins, and Jesus here is talking about a human sacrifice to cover all of the sins forever going forward. One sacrifice. This is craziness. It doesn't make sense in the culture at that time. And the Pharisees, they're offended. They don't like the things that Jesus is saying, right? It doesn't make sense to them, and especially because Jesus is growing quite a massive following at this point. And so partially they're being stripped away of their power, and they don't like it, and they're offended, and it goes against what they teach. Because what they taught at the time was all based around the Old Testament, and it was from the prophets. God had given it to them. Now that doesn't mean that what Jesus is saying isn't in the Bible, but they missed it. They were blind to it. They thought that the Messiah that was to come was going to be this great king that would come and save them from Roman rule, that would come and make Israel and Jerusalem the superpower of the world, this great and mighty king. But here comes Jesus, and he's the complete opposite of what their expectations were. Complete opposite of what their expectations were. And so he offended them enough, and they didn't like him enough that they decided to kill him, and they plotted to kill him. And they put Jesus and they nailed him on the cross. Now, the cross isn't exactly part of my message today, but I can't just blow over it. So we're gonna camp there for just a second. While Jesus was being nailed on the cross, it's crazy to think that at every single moment that he was up there, he chose to stay up there, right? Jesus said that no one takes my life, but only I lay it down. That means when they put those 9-inch nails through his wrists and feet, in that very moment, he chose not to stay there. He says, don't you think I could call legions of angels down to rescue me? Just imagine that picture of heaven. There's just angels waiting for the call. They're just like chomping at the bit to go and save Jesus, but he never calls them, never at all. He says, no one takes my life, but I lay it down. And love didn't feel good at that time. I think that we can get that confused, that love is something that feels good. We've been watching too many movies. Love is what Jesus is doing. And I think about, as he was fading in and out of consciousness on that cross, what may have been going through his head. Why is he kept up there? Why didn't he call the angels down? And I think he probably was looking at the pain and suffering of what eternal separation from him would look like. But he was also looking at the joy and at the fullness of life that we would have as an inheritance to be with him forever afterwards. And that's what kept him up there. There is a saying by a Christian rapper, his name is Propaganda. I don't even have it written it down, I've got it memorized, it's so good. He says, but worth, beauty, and value are not determined by innate qualities, but by the length at which the owner would go to possess them. And broken and ugly things, just like us, are stamped excellent with ink tapped in wells of divine veins. Jesus purchased us. Jesus values us. He loves us, and he explained that in the most loving act that anybody could ever perform. So the Pharisees, they crucify him. And I bet you that partially in their mind, they're thinking, we've squashed this. We cut the head of the snake off, we're done. Right? These heretical, blasphemous people, they're over with. Never mind that at the crucifixion, the temple broke in half, and there was an earthquake, and all this crazy stuff. Abandon those facts. They thought they were over with it. But unfortunately for them, there was a terribly irritating, horribly inconvenient fact coming their way, is that Jesus was coming out of that grave, right? It's exciting, yeah. And he appeared to hundreds of people once he did. And so here's the thing, is that I don't know exactly what everybody here believes, but the resurrection is a proven, historical, irrefutable fact that it happened. As much as you can prove anything in history, you can prove that this happened. And this is really bad news for the Pharisees, because now they got to face something. Of course, not all of them believe that it happened, and they were still offended, and they still sought to kill off all of the followers of Jesus and all of the disciples of Jesus. Even though they saw the temple break, they still didn't believe. They were still offended, and chief offended among them was Saul. Just hang out with me. We're about to get into the body of the sermon here. That was just my introduction. Chief offended among them was Saul. The Bible, the gospel, offended Saul more than it has offended any one of us in here ever, or more than it has offended anybody that we know. He sought with all of his strength to imprison and kill Christians. That he made that his life's purpose. We pick it up in Acts chapter 9, verses 1 to 9. But Saul, still breathing threats of murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way was Christianity, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Something's about to happen to Saul here. Something's about to happen to Saul that makes him Paul. Now, as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly light from heaven shone around him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, who are you, Lord? As if saying, like, God, is that you? And Jesus said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do. The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but not seeing anyone. Saul rose from the ground, and although his eyes were opened, he saw nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And for 3 days he was without sight, and he neither ate nor drank. Saul, who was terribly offended with Christianity, Saul, who had a lot of things that he didn't like about what the Christian perspective of the Bible was, all of a sudden is faced with this paradigm-shattering fact. He sees in person Jesus raised out of the grave. He sees in person Jesus raised from the dead. And we know, if you've read the Bible, you know that after that period of 3 days, Saul hits the ground running, and he becomes the tip of the spear of Christianity, doesn't he? Right? He wrote most of the New Testament, not all of them, but he's got a significant influence there. And so what happened to him during that time? Well, ultimately what happened was that he was faced with the resurrection, but what the resurrection did for him is it opened up the rest of the scripture. I was listening to a talk by a guy named Tim Keller. If you haven't listened to him, he's great. Go give him a listen. But he explores into what was it that Paul or Saul was thinking during those 3 days when he was blind, laying in bed, not eating or not drinking. So here's what he says. First of all, he says that the word Messiah means the anointed one, the loved one, or the blessed one. So a Messiah would be somebody who pleases God wholly, who pleases God entirely. And of course, we know that because having read the Bible, from our perspective, we see at Jesus' baptism, the skies open up, and God said, "This is my son with whom I am well pleased." God is confirming Jesus as this is the Messiah, which the prophets talked about. Now, I don't know if Saul knew that at this moment, but he would have known that a Messiah would be somebody who pleases God wholly. But here's where it would have been confusing, is that Jesus lived a poor life, right? Remember when the rich guy tried to follow Jesus and Jesus said, "The Son of Man has no place to lay his head"? He lived a poor life. He died on a cross, which was meant to be a death for the lowest of the low, right? The people that died beside Jesus were murderers and robbers, the lowest of the low. It was a disgraceful, degrading, horrendous death with no dignity. But so Saul would have thought, well, that's not the favor of God, right? He would have looked at that and be like, well, I wouldn't look at that life in somebody and think, wow, they really have the favor of God. Even Jesus on the cross said to himself, "God, why have you forsaken me?" But if God raised him from the dead, it means that God did vindicate him, that God did love him, that he did please God. And if God did love him and he was cursed, then he wouldn't have been cursed so for his own sake, but for someone else's sin. And of course, Paul would have been able to turn to the rest of the Bible, which he would have had in his head because of the education system he would have grown up in, would have had him memorize the entire Old Testament to a point where he could just recall it. He would have looked at the first half of Isaiah, which talks about this great king, which is what they had expected, right? To free Israel, to free the world of oppression. But then he would have looked at the second half of Isaiah, which talks about this suffering servant. And he would have thought, well, could they be this? They couldn't be the same person, could they? But if the resurrection, well, yeah, they could. We looked at Isaiah where God talks about a new covenant, and he says that I will write my law on my people's heart. Well, if that's where God's going to write his law, then there's no more need for a temple. We become the temple. Paul realizes that it's a Messiah who comes in weakness for those who would admit their weakness and need of salvation, and not a Messiah who comes in strength for those who can muster the strength to follow him. Faced with the fact of his resurrection, all of a sudden, it doesn't matter what Paul likes or what Paul doesn't like. And understanding that opened up Scripture to Paul. Right? Like if you have a fact, like there's a fact, it doesn't matter whether I like it or not, it doesn't change that fact. It's a fact. Paul, faced with the fact of the resurrection, all of a sudden it didn't matter what he did or he didn't like. In our culture today, we tend to sometimes look at Christianity through that same lens. Some people won't become Christians. They won't like the Bible because of what it says about money, right? Like what it says about giving some of your money to the furtherance of God's kingdom. They won't like that. Some people won't like the Bible because of what it says about sex. It offends them, and they can't jump on board. But faced with the fact of the resurrection, Paul was forced to reconcile with all the scriptures. Sometimes when we're talking to somebody and they have all these ethical issues, I don't agree with this, I don't agree with that, I don't like this, I don't like that. We just got to ask, do you believe that Jesus came out of the grave? Forget everything. Do you believe that happened? Because if you do, you're going to have to wrestle with it. And it's okay to wrestle, and it's okay to have questions. But if all of the things you can't get on board with, look at that and what that means for us. Paul hits the ground running. Later on, we see in his life, he goes around now and he's spreading the gospel with just this intensity that is just crazy. Like one time, he went into this village, they killed him. And then his disciples dragged him out, and they prayed for him to come back to life. And he did. And what's the first thing that he did? He went back into the village. He wasn't like, oh, I should avoid that place now. It's just a complete opposite change. And it happened to him because of the understanding of the resurrection. So now he is on his travels. And you guys remember the story? He has that... There's that fortune teller, that demon-possessed fortune teller that is following them and pestering them for days and days and days. And finally, he gets enough. He's had enough of this. And he looks at this fortune teller, and he casts a demon out of her, right? And now she's no longer able to tell fortunes. And her owners are angry, because this was their way of making money. This was their girl, their slave girl, and she would tell fortunes for people, which would pay, and now they lost that power. What they didn't know is that later on, she'd probably be able to tell fortunes 7 times as well, but they didn't know that, and so they're angry. And so we'll pick up our story here. It says, and when they, the owners, Acts 16, 20-25, I don't know if I said it. And when they, the owners, had brought them to the magistrates, they said, "These men are Jews, and they are disturbing our city." They weren't disturbing the city, they were disturbing them. "They advocate customs that are not lawful for us Romans to accept and practice," which is probably true. The crowd, now this is where it gets crazy, the crowd joined in attacking them. And the magistrates tore their garments off and gave orders to beat them with rods. Another word for this is flogging. So now they're being gang beat by the entire village with rods, Paul and Silas. "And when they had inflicted many blows upon them, they threw them into prison, ordering the jailer to keep them safely, make sure they don't get out. Having received this order, the jailer put them into the innermost prison, the tightest of lockdowns, and he fastened their feet with stocks so that even in the cell they couldn't move about freely. And at about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them." This is a very horrible, no good, very bad day, right? They've been beat by, it's probably as many people as are here. They've been put into a max security prison. They've had their feet in stocks, and they're sleepless at midnight, but they're worshiping. They're not even angry. They're not even complaining. This passage, I'm really trying not to blow over here, because this should be one of the most challenging passages in the Bible for us as Christians in our behavior. Because we complain. I complain a lot, and I get checked and I feel ridiculous every time I do. And I know that you complain a lot. And I know that you at home in the camera complain a lot. We just complain, and we can be unchecked. And I'm not just preaching this to you guys, this is for me as well. Reading this is a very challenging passage. He's worshiping after all of this has happened to him. I've had bad days. I've never had a day this bad. What is that? What is that power that he possesses that I don't have? How do I get it? Romans 8:18, Paul says, "For I consider that the suffering of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us." It's the hope that he has in the resurrection that enables him to behave and act in the way that he is acting during his challenging circumstance. Every religion in the world that offers some kind of bliss after this life offers only a compensation for the things that you may have gone through. And it's a work-based compensation at that. Christianity, because of the resurrection, only one, is the only religion that offers a restoration that you don't even have to work for, of the things that you have lost or the ways that you've been made to feel wrong. The only thing that rights wrongs and recovers what's lost. And not recovers it to a state that it was when you lost it, but to an even better state than that. Like I said at the beginning, think about the children dying of starvation in another world, another country. I know it's not great to think about. But the hope of the resurrection says that, you know what? When you pass on from this reality and you go to the next one, because of what Jesus did, you're going to eat every night, and Jesus is going to pick up the tab forever and for eternity. The person that's in the wheelchair that looks around and just wants to walk, that's what they want. Well, they might live the rest of their life in that wheelchair, but in heaven they're going to be restored to better that they had. The restoration of what you have lost and the right for what's been made wrong, right? Some people are locked in bad situations, but that's over once you get to heaven because of the resurrection. The suffering of today is not worth comparing to the glory that we will have in heaven. And Paul was so irreversibly, undoubtedly aware of this, that even in shackles, having been beat, put in prison, unable to sleep at midnight, he is able to worship instead of grumble. He's able to worship instead of curse. And that has significant outcome as we're going to read on. Acts verse 16, sorry, I get my verse and chapters mixed up. Acts chapter 16, verse 26 to 31. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately all of the doors were opened, and everybody's bonds were unfastened. This earthquake was so crazy that even their shackles loosed. While the jailer woke up and he saw the prison doors were open, he drew a sword because he was about to kill himself, supposing that all the prisoners had escaped. But Paul cried out with a loud voice, "Don't harm yourself, for we are all here." And the jailer called for lights and rushed in. And the temple, and trembling with fear, he fell down before Paul and Silas. Then he brought them out and said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" And they said, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved of your household." And you will be saved of your house, sorry. You will be saved, you and your household. That's different. You and your household. But here's what didn't happen. And here's how we behave, and here's how I behave. I have a tough situation. And my attitude, I'm going to be honest with you guys, you ever have prayer as your last resort? You know, like something bad happens and you try to make it all work yourself and then it doesn't. And then when you're really tired, when you're really overcooked and you're done, then finally you decide, this is the time to pray. That is an unfortunate habit of mine that I'm working on. But when I'm in a bad situation, from that attitude, I am wishing and hoping and praying that God just rescues me from the jail, rescue me from my shackles, heal my wounds because people beat me unfairly, right? And this actually happens for them. All of that happens. Miraculously, the jail cells open, the shackles are moved off, maybe their bodies are even healed. I don't know. It doesn't say that, but it's a miracle nonetheless. And they aren't saying, "Praise you, Jesus. We're freed. We can go now. We can continue on our travels and tell people about Jesus." They stayed there despite having been set free. And in turn, they were able to show love to the jailer, who I'm sure was listening to them sing worship songs in their time of suffering. And at that moment, he probably thought, what is this power that they have? Praising God during your suffering and not complaining when hardship comes is a great witness for Jesus to those that are around you and to those that are watching. But because of their attitude, it led to love for the jailer. They stayed in the prison because they cared more about his eternity than they did about their present situation. Sometimes the attitude that you have is to escape your situation rather than to change other people's eternities. How can this be used to shape the eternity of somebody else? The jailer and his entire household were saved because they stayed. Because their reality was not the same as mine would have been in that situation. They were praising God. They're having a worship service in there. Worship team, I'll call you guys back up. The resurrection was the power of Paul's song and suffering and love for the jailer. Sometimes complaining puts us in a position of looking for a blessing rather than being a blessing. And I think that we could forget that loss and wrongs are not as great if you believe fully in the hope of the resurrection of Jesus through the power of the resurrection. Are we living as representatives of the hope of the resurrection? I'm not saying now that it's not okay to have a hard time. That's not the message that I'm trying to get across to you guys today. But I'm just trying to say that there is hope in Jesus. There is hope in what he did when he came out of that grave. And that hope is yours if you choose to accept him and live your life and give it to him. Christianity is the only religion where you don't have to work for it, right? That's the one difference between this and everybody else, is that this is immense love and it's a free gift that we get to go with. But we also need to remember the reality of that. And we need to walk and be able to walk in the hope that it's a short time. And in heaven, all will be restored perfectly.